sorry, it's me.
Switch the image over. Good afternoon. Welcome to the second in our series, the Autumn U3A series. I must say it's great to be talking face to face with people. I'm personally zoomed out. As per the last series, this seminar is being streamed live on YouTube. You can go back and have a look at it again if you like. Streaming allows us to reach a number of people who aren't able to get here for any reason. But it's also diversifying the audience that we're getting. Toilets, either left or right. If you go that way, you turn right again. If you go left, you just keep going straight down towards the gymnasium. In the event of an emergency, please, same routes and meet in the car parks. Could you please ensure your cell phone's at least on silent, if not off? We will take a break for afternoon tea when the speaker's finished. And then we'll come back here about 15 or 20 minutes later. So if you've got a question, you'll find at the desk there's a sheet of paper where you can put the question, and that way the speaker will actually have it in text in front of them in terms of, rather than you're having to try and make yourself heard over the crowd. So our speaker today is Professor Murray Potter. He's got a PhD in Zoology from Massey University. He's been working both nationally and internationally to find practical solutions to human-wildlife conflict. His areas of expertise include conservation biology, reproductive and stress physiology, avian nutrition, avian migration, entomology, looks at kiwi, stoats, penguins, and his research includes studies that have integrated ecology, physiology, behaviour and natural history of whole organisms and their natural settings, including how temporal constraints, stress, morphology and nutrition underpin and interact with the animal's behaviour and ecology. So in particular, he's interested in invertebrates and vertebrate behaviour, physiology, nutrition, conservation, and predatory prey population dynamics. For his PhD, Murray studied the ecology, reproduction, behaviour and reproductive endocrinology of North Island brown kiwis. He provided the first description of changes in the plasma steroid concentrations during the reproductive cycle of this specific and described how sex role reversal has resulted in male kiwi that display not only highly seasonal cyclic in plasma testosterone levels, but they also attain peak levels of both ostradiol and progesterone that can exceed those in females. So in terms of role reversals, the kiwi's a pretty clever bird. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Murray.
Thank you very much. Hi everybody, thank you for that introduction. So yes, in the presentation we're going to give now, we're going to address what is really the most critical challenge of this time. In saying that, I'm not diminishing the stuff that's going on around the world that's so horrible. It's just that when we look at the way that the world is unfolding, it's the issues that I'm going to cover today that actually supersede all of the other troubles that we see on the planet. And I guess I'll say right at the outset that one of the things that perhaps should give us hope is that we saw during COVID, and we're seeing during the current Russian invasion, the way that the world or big parts of it can respond when focused on a challenge. And I think that should give us some optimism, because when we have a stark, honest look at where we're at the moment and the challenges we face, it's very easy to get somewhat depressed about it. So I will give you some hope towards the end. I'll also give you a little bit of a glimpse into the joy that I experience and have experienced in the job that I have and the opportunities it has created. Because while we face a biological crisis, a biodiversity crisis, we live in an amazing place, on an amazing planet, and life on this planet is phenomenal. And so one of the great opportunities that the positions I've got has opened up for me is an opportunity to travel widely. I need to plant several forests to compensate for that, and to interact with wildlife in many different locations. So I like photography. The first part of the talk, before I get into the main part of it, is really to give you a glimpse of just how beautiful the wildlife is on this planet. And the photos going through, some of these have come from the subantarctic islands. There's some from the Pacific Islands. And when you have a chance to actually move away from the cities that we've built, the urban environment, and interact and experience the world in locations where there are fewer people, it is beautiful. And I think we should be reminded of this often, because it's very easy to forget this. The wild world is critical to the functioning of the artificial world that humans create. And we can delude ourselves that we are separate from that wild world, but we are not. Because all of the interactions that occur out there away from cities are interactions that feed into the diversity of Earth and the biosphere, and actually enable us to continue existing. And we are not separate from this, despite the fact we create the illusion that we are. We are very much part of the natural world. We have just grown in numbers and in influence to greatly impact it. These slides cover, obviously, there's birds, there's flowers, and there's invertebrates. And these are just little glimpses of some of the extraordinary beauty of the world that we actually live in. So, having given you that very quick view of some of the beauty of the planet and the biodiversity within it, we have to now confront reality. Most of us spend most of our lives living in man-made environments. Most of us live in cities. And the disconnect that has created globally between us and the natural world is problematic, because I suspect that everyone in this room, maybe those watching, will have some inkling of the fact that we need to acknowledge that the natural world is critical to us and that we are part of it. But it's easy to pretend otherwise and to delude ourselves. Over 55% of the people in the world now live in urban areas. It's astonishing. More than half the people on the planet no longer live in environments away from human-constructed systems. And that influences the way we view the world. It influences the support that we can get when we try to make a difference in that world and to tell people about the critical interactions that we have with nature. I'm going to get into the gloomy bit We're going to talk briefly about extinctions. Extinctions are natural phenomena. But what we know is that the current rate of extinctions is causing a biodiversity crisis. And it's surprisingly difficult to actually get really clear data on the rate of extinction at this moment. But the best guesses are that it's somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times the background extinction rate that you would expect. And it is absolutely at a level where we know that human activities threatens Earth's biodiversity. And this is at all levels. When we look at extinction events in the past, we can learn to understand what was behind those. And we can hopefully learn to understand what it is that we need to change to prevent the fate that would otherwise await us. So we know there's fossil records that show that most species that have ever existed are extinct. That's the truth. The vast majority of species that have ever been on this planet over the last 3 billion years or more have clearly gone. And extinction can be caused by changes in a species' biotic, living, and abiotic, non-living environments. Extinction can actually happen another way, which isn't mentioned on the slide, but we tend to think about extinction as being the end of a line. And for the most part, that is what it is. But species can go extinct through a different mechanism, and that is through evolutionary change over long periods of time. So while it is true that dinosaurs are extinct, they have left descendants, and we can enjoy them in the form of birds around us. So there is that other form of extinction where species change dramatically over long, long periods of time. But in this context, we're talking about extinction of the former type, the type when they're terminated. And there are points in Earth's history when we have had mass extinction events. There have been 5 of these, and they're shown in this figure here. And there are 2 lines on this, and what we're looking at is periods when there were massive loss of biodiversity, and the scale is in families. When we're looking at those red peaks, we are seeing across that time scale on the bottom the periods when we had huge loss of biodiversity. And we're going to look at just 2 of these. We'll look at the highest of those peaks, the Permian extinction. The Permian was the most severe mass extinction in Earth's history. This event that happened about 252 million years ago almost exterminated life on Earth. It occurred over a period of less than 500,000 years. And during that period, about 96% of all marine life went extinct, and 70% of the rather small amount of terrestrial life went extinct. So this was a massive, massive event. And when we look back and try and understand what was behind it, we realize that, as is the case for so many of these things, it was a little complex. There were a number of factors that seemed to be at play at the same time. This was a period when there was a lot of volcanism, particularly in what is now Siberia. We know that there was significant global warming and ocean acidification. And there was a massive release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. There was also extensive anoxic conditions that resulted from nutrient enrichment in ecosystems. So when we look at those, the one in red stands out because it links to what's happening now. Let's jump forward to the Cretaceous mass extinction. This is the one that we most often think about because this is the most recent. And this was when the dinosaurs, except for the birds, went extinct. And more than half of all marine species and many, many families of terrestrial plants and animals ended at this point in time. What was behind this? Well, this was the actual proximal cause of it was different, but the consequences of that were similar to the previous one. In this case, there was the misfortune of a large meteor hitting Earth. And it hit in the Yucatan Peninsula, and there is a crater that is huge that is there. So this event happened suddenly in terms of that impact, but the consequences that followed were similar to the other in the sense that there was atmospheric change. There was a vast amount of debris that was thrown up. The temperatures on the Earth, in that case, plummeted. And once you get massive change in a very short period like that, many species died quickly, and then you get ecological cascades. And ecosystems collapse as a consequence of the things that happened in those first moments and first days and first months and first couple of years. When we look at mass extinctions, we know that the recovery time is long. Typically, it's at least 5 to 10 million years. In the Permian, it took about 100 million years for biodiversity to redevelop to anything like the level that existed beforehand. And with that known background rate of extinction that we're observing now, we know for a fact you don't get it back quickly. We don't get it back in anything of relevance to a human lifetime, or anything of temporal relevance to the period of time that humans have even existed. These are events that take extraordinarily long time to recover from. So we now know that we have all of the signs of entering a sixth mass extinction event. And I guess that the people had suspected that we might be doing this for some time, but most people and media and so on became aware of it following the publication in Nature in March 2011, asking the question about whether the Earth's sixth extinction was already underway. And this was talking about what we're seeing with biodiversity loss that has occurred since about 10,000 BC through to the present. So let's think about what was behind it. And there are huge numbers of examples that make me cringe, feel embarrassed about our species, about how we have treated this extraordinary place that we live and call home. We have this incredibly long history of treating wildlife badly. So do you know what those things are there? These are the heads of the skulls of the bison in America. And what is extraordinary is that it's estimated in that previous image there's something perhaps like 180,000 skulls in that pile. In the 16th century, it's estimated there was something like 30 million bison living in the plains of the United States. And by the late 1880s, that entire global population was 541. And almost all of that was due to slaughter by people. There are examples closer to home. Down on Macquarie Island, which is one of the subantarctic islands south of New Zealand. It's actually technically part of Australia, but it is closer to us. This was discovered in 1810 by Frederick Hasselborough. And he was one of many people who was looking for whales or alternatives to it, to be able to have oil. This wasn't oil that was extracted from the ground, it was oil that was extracted from animals. And between 1810 and 1919, seals and then penguins were hunted on Macquarie Island almost to the brink of extinction. This is, as with almost all the photos in this, my photo, this is a photograph of Lusitania Bay, which is on the southeastern side of Macquarie Island. And sitting in it are these large metal containers. The way that oil was extracted was that men, and it was men, went amongst the penguins, picked them up, threw them like a rugby ball to people standing on top of those vats and dropped them in. And there were fires under them, and they melted them, threw them in alive and melted them to supply oil. So the photo is actually a colour photo, but I have never shown anybody the colour photo because to me it's too grim to show in colour. So what can we do about where we're at? In terms of the professions that feed into this, because the truth is that we all need to be involved, and I'll come to that later. But in terms of the professions that lead into this, on the biological side, we have conservation biology and wildlife management. And then we have a whole heap of social sciences that feed into this, and political sciences and so on. But if we think about the biological management of species, we have conservation biology, which tends to deal with the development of the theory of how you go about conserving things. And you have wildlife management, which tends to be more towards the let's actually put that theory into practice and apply it and manage species or locations or habitats or ecosystems. And so there's a very strong link between these two. When we look at the threats to biodiversity, we have habitat loss, introduced species, overharvesting, pollution, and global change. And all of those have had a massive, massive impact. When we think about the state of the world, we can easily find indications of how bad it is at the moment and how it's heading in the wrong direction. And these are just some quick examples out of media out of the last 2.5 years or so. So several of these have come from the science and environment part of the BBC World News websites. We have this nature crisis. Humans threaten 1 million species with extinction. We have this wonderful article that was produced in the Stuff site back, this is stuff.co.nz, back in 2019, before our focus changed to COVID. And it was called 407 and Rising, the basis of the climate emergency. And it's, if you haven't looked at it, it's still there. It is fantastically well put together, and it gives a concise cover to why the carbon dioxide levels are rising and why this is so important. So I looked this morning at what the current level is. This is in parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And it's 422. That's up from 407 in 2019. Last year was 418, 2020 was 412. So it's rising right now at about 1% per year. And even if we stopped burning fossil fuels right now, it's going to keep rising for quite a while, because it's not just fossil fuels, it's also methane from primarily agriculture, and within that primarily consumption of beef and dairy. We, as a consequence of those 5 things are listed that are drivers of this change, we have a country where our native fish are threatened, where our freshwater systems are polluted, where we have serious issues there. Remember, before we became aware of COVID and how it was going to affect us, remember the huge bushfires in Australia between June 2019 and February 2020. This was a huge event, and we've sort of forgotten about it. Well, if we're on the other side of the Tasman, we forget about it. But in that event, at least 3 billion animals died. And while there was lots of reasons why each individual fire was started, and lots of reasons why there was so much fuel there to burn in the first place, the fact is that stuff was extraordinarily dry unusually dry, because of climate change. And jump forward to the last year or so, and parts of Australia that were burning back then have been flooded. And that's what we can expect from climate change. We can expect these huge swings, dry and wet, huge, an increase in extremes. And that is now becoming the norm. Bizarrely and disappointingly, when most of the world went into COVID lockdown, the Amazon deforestation increased to the highest levels ever, because the people who were given the job of policing the forests and making sure that they were safe as much as can be possible in Brazil at the moment, they were isolating. And so a massive increase in deforestation occurred in the Amazon. So extinctions are real, they're happening rapidly, and they're of massive concern. And I've got this slide here because even when we try to do the right thing, we are so far down this path that it's often the wrong thing. We have, in our efforts to move away from heating houses with firewood, moved to using air conditioners. 10% of the global CO2 emissions at the moment are directly linked to the production and use of air conditioning units. So we thought this was a solution. But what happens when you create this technology? What happens when you move people from farmland into cities? If you're on farm and it's cold, you go and put another layer of clothing on. If you're in town and it's cold, you turn the heat pump on. If it's warm, you turn the air conditioning on. If you travel anywhere in the tropical zone around the planet now, you will see hundreds of millions of these, billions of them. They're everywhere, because suddenly no one actually wants to thermoregulate with clothing. They want to thermoregulate with electricity. There will be a time when no one will understand this picture, but I think we're still close enough to it in history to still appreciate it. Climate change is now accepted by almost everyone. What is the elephant in the room with all of this? I'm going to come back to this elephant because she taught me some valuable lessons. That happens at the end of the story. On Sunday, this Sunday we've just had, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I went on to a website where you can look at the current world population. And it's got an algorithm. It's obviously not counting births and deaths really, but it's extremely accurate within the margins of error that are acceptable. And it's worth going on to this site and having a look at the rate at which people are being born and the rate at which people are dying, and what the accumulation of those two things is. So, at 2 p.m. on Sunday the 15th of May this year, there was 7,947,067,792, plus or minus a couple, people. 1 hour later, the number had gone from, look at the last 5 digits, 67,792 to 77,000. In 1 hour, the population grew 9,500. That means that on that day, and yesterday, and today, the world's population on every one of those days has grown by more than 250,000 people every day. Every year at the moment, the world's population is growing at more than 82 million people. It's easy to forget that in New Zealand, we've got a tiny, tiny fraction of the population growth equivalent for a year. Our population is tiny. These are huge numbers. So, what happened? This is the graphic of the growth in the human population size. And it was an exponential growth. It is not anymore, but there are a lot of people and we're still going up. So when we look at the human population, at the dawn of agriculture, if we go back 8,000 years, the population of the world was approximately 5 million, about the same as New Zealand. 8,000 BC, the global human population was just like the population of this country. Then, over the following 8,000 odd years, it grew to about 200 million. It took all of human history through till 1800 for the world's population to reach 1 billion. The 2nd billion was reached in 130 years. The 3rd billion in 30, the 4th in 15 years, the 5th in 13 years. This is a time scale of which we are adding another billion people to the planet. And in the 20th century, it grew from less than 2 billion to about 6 billion. Right now, we are extremely close to 8 billion. When I was born, and when the vast majority of you in this room were born, the global world's population was less than 3 billion people. Some of you, it was probably around 2.5 billion. And now it's nearly 8 billion. And it's projected to keep going up. We know it's going to hit 10. The question is, can we stop it getting to 11, 12, and so on? And the consequence of this is there are a lot of people on the planet. And things that used to be sustainable are no longer sustainable. That huge mass of humanity is so great that when we add our own biomass and that of compare that with the biomass of wild mammals, humans now outweigh by an order of magnitude the biomass of all wild mammals on this planet. That includes the elephants. So there's a lot of us. And this simple pie chart, I think, is very sobering, just for me. When we look at this, when we look at the percentage of current total global terrestrial vertebrate biomass by type, we see that humans make up 36% of the terrestrial mammal biomass. The livestock we grow makes up nearly 60%. All of the stuff that's wild that we'd love to see on BBC documentaries, all of those mammals that David Attenborough has brought into our living rooms on television comprise 4% of the biomass of mammals. And then we add in the biomass of birds. Sorry, this chart's actually for the biomass of vertebrates. So, yeah. We add in wild birds. There's only about 1%. There are 3 times more mass of chickens on Earth at the moment than there are of all of the free-living wild birds. What have we done to this place? You know, we've been doing it for a long time, but there are a lot more of us now. So human activity during the Quaternary led to megafauna extinctions. This is between about 50,000 years ago and about 3,000 years ago. And we lost during that period about half of the large, over 40 kilograms in mass, land mammals. And the biomass of wild land mammals before this period of extinction was about 7 times higher than it is today. Yeah? What is really sobering is that we now have more mammal biomass on the planet than we did then. About a factor of 6 times more. Why? Because we love cows and sheep, mostly. Plus a few other things that we throw in there. Yeah? There is a really, really good publication that's going to be the latest one coming out sometime later this year. And it's called the Living Planet Report. And I'm going to draw on content from the 2018 and 2020 reports. And it says that we live in an age of rapid and unprecedented planetary change. And it identifies here that there is another thing to population growth that is critically important. It's consumption. We consume stuff. Amongst my travels, I've had the opportunity to travel to some very remote parts of China, where people, when I went there at least, were still pretty much living on the lands and what they could eke out of it in their local environments. And those people, many of them have since been moved into cities through, which some would argue has improved their well-being. It's given them new opportunities and so on. But it's done another thing. It has elevated the demand for electricity. It has elevated demand for consumption. Things that people used to be completely happy and content with 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago are no longer sufficient. We need to entertain ourselves with electric phones, cell phones, iPads, computers. We use electricity, we use energy in a way that we didn't used to need. And we think this is somehow making us feel happier. Whether we're aware of it or not, our existence depends intrinsically on the ecological services that the natural world provides. And the latest estimates of the value of that is an annual sum of around about 125 trillion US dollars. This is the service, the range of services we get and do not pay for. We take it from our planet. We extract it and we use it and we abuse it and don't pay a cent in compensation for this vast, vast sum of money. And yet there are a huge number of things that we need to rely on from those services that we get for free and have always taken for granted. So we'll have a little bit more deep look into the Living Planet Report from 2020 and some of the diagrams from 2018. And this is every 2 years, the Institute of Zoology, in conjunction, this is in London, in conjunction with WWF, do this global assessment of how we're doing. And their most recent report concludes that we're pushing our planet to the brink. Human activity, how we feed, fuel, finance our lives, is taking an unprecedented toll on wildlife, on wild places, and the natural resources that we need to survive. And the first chapter of the most recent report sends out an SOS for nature. There are some figures in here, and you don't need to be able to see the details other than the fact of the trend lines for all of these. About 1950, things started to change dramatically on the planet. And our use and abuse of resources increased. Obviously, this was linked to population growth, but it was also linked to consumption. And so whether it was the use of electricity, the use of fuels and so on, the same sort of things happened. And we've got this rapid expansion from about 1950 to now, and all of these things are indicating stuff that is negatively impacting on the planet. And all of them are being driven by that combination of human population size and our ever-increasing desire to consume and throw away and waste. And the threats and the drivers have these connections between them. And what we have is we want food, we want resources, we want business, we want money. And so we have pressures on farmland, on forestry, on wildlife, on extraction of oil. And those cause threats to our very existence. And they flow then into the orange, into the biodiversity, the impacts on biodiversity. And so there are a set of cascade effects. When we look at the big picture, of all the plants, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammal species that have gone extinct since about 1500, 3/4 of them were harmed by overexploitation or agriculture or both. And right now, there's only about 1/4 of the land area on Earth that is substantially free of the impacts of human activities. If you look at a topographical map, you will see why most of that 1/4 still exists. Because most of it is in the blimmin' steep mountains and is hard to modify. So of the stuff that is actually easily modified, most of it has been. Most of it has been. The picture is really, really seriously bleak. Down the bottom you see that sum that I mentioned before of $125 trillion US in services we get for free and just accept. Between 1970 and 2014, when we got the most recent data available, we had a decline of 60% in that tiny period in populations of wild mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians. 60% reduction since 1970. And as almost everyone here knows, that wasn't very long ago. 50% of the freshwater and coastal habitat has been destroyed in the last 30 years. Half of it's gone or been seriously destroyed in just 30 years. A fifth of the Amazon has gone, and the rate of destruction there is increasing. Now, we know that this is not about any specific government, because in New Zealand, agriculture has been a big part of our history. We know that there's a report that's come out about the plan to tackle climate change. And the most recent plan is to invest in technology to stop cows doing what cows do. Cows produce methane. And sure, we can invest vast sums, is it 600 million, 700 million, something, into research to try and make them burp less, or we could stop eating the bloody things. We have solutions, and no one seems to want to go for the obvious. Why not do the obvious? Yes, it impacts on people's livelihood, but doing nothing is going to have a greater impact on people's livelihood, because we will not be able to continue existing on this planet. So we need to face reality that we need to change, and we need to do stuff totally different to the way we've been doing it. Right now, the world is a mess. It truly is. And this is a photo I took from a car in Bangkok, but it's a mess in so many ways, not just there. I'm not quite sure how the linesmen ever figure out which line to connect to what, but it's pretty impressive. And also the bamboo ladders are pretty impressive. So globally, we have truly enormous problems. I like this because it doesn't say, what can we do? It doesn't ask that question. It says, what can I do? The solution here obviously requires governments to act. We're fortunate that we live in a country where we can have influence over the people who are in government. So ultimately it comes back to us. We can have a political influence, both within our own country and within international fora. But there's other things we can do. In 1987, the United Nations Commission defined the term sustainability. And we use this a lot and think of it as a term that has always been there. It hasn't. It's a comparatively recent term. And its definition is worth considering, viewing. The definition produced in 1987 was that sustainability is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Yeah? So it's about what we need now, but also forward-looking. What do we need to do so that our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, our great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren actually have a planet that is still livable? Why is sustainability so hard to achieve? It's really because it goes against everything we have been programmed to do, everything we have done thus far. We need to change so many things. It's not tweaking. It's massive change in the way we live as individuals, because we're the only, ultimately it's only ourselves that we can have absolute control over, but how we live on this planet. We need to do things differently. So that brings me to, I guess, my hero, Sir David Attenborough. What's he now? 96, I think. And he has lived through this period of enormous change. And he didn't intend to set out to document it in film, but he did. And there's probably no person, individual on the planet who is better placed to evaluate it and provide some sound advice. And he has said that we must recognize that if we have become powerful enough to change the entire planet, then we are powerful enough to moderate our impact and to work with nature rather than against it. Some of you may have read his book that came out 18 months ago, and it gives a personal account of what he has observed as we have destroyed this planet. But he's also put forward 7 action points, and we'll run through these. Number 1, put people and planet before profit. Easy to say, incredibly hard to do, because all of us want to live comfortably. All of us have some desire to have a decent income. All of us have a history of what we have been comfortable with, and by and large are reluctant to change that. But it is our hunger for perpetual economic growth that lies at the heart of this. Biologically, we know that you can't sustain exponential growth forever. Human population's still going up and it's got a long way to go, but it's not growing exponentially anymore. And for one reason or many reasons, we will end up peaking and crashing. And economies are the same. Somehow we need to find economic solutions that are about stability, not endless growth, because endless growth and endless consumption are massive parts of the problem. Number 2, replace oil with renewable energy. And we're doing this here. You look around on the hills. And it's happening in many parts of the world. Last year, 85% of the world's energy was provided by fossil fuels alone. If there was anything that potentially, of even the slightest bit of value that could come out of the conflict in Europe at the moment, would be for nations to try and be self-sufficient with energy and not depend on other nations and not depend on fossil fuels for energy sources. And I think that would be probably the only thing I can think of that could possibly come from what's going on at the moment. We need, as individuals, to embrace a sustainable lifestyle, and that's hard to do. You can go onto the internet and you can work out your own personal carbon footprint, and I did that yesterday and I was a bit horrified. If you can get it under 10, I've forgotten the units, tons, it must be more than that. Anyway, per year, you're doing well. Mine came out at 15 and I was a bit horrified because I have taken a few too many flights. And that's not a good thing. But we need to be aware of it, about what our impact, our personal impact is, and what we can do to reduce that. We should create no fishing zones in the ocean. I grew up in Auckland, and my father was a wood turner, so he didn't make very much money. But I recall my brothers and myself having huge snapper. It was smoked almost always, on every Friday night. And they were caught in a Hauraki Gulf. The only snapper that I have seen in recent years of the proportions of the snapper that you used to buy in the shops back in the 60s were off the coastline near Hawera when I went out fishing, and there's some big ones there. But essentially most of them have gone through over harvest, commercial and recreational. Very, very, very little of our ocean's surface is protected. Ocean volume, I guess. is protected. And that needs to change. We need to farm smarter, and we need to eat less meat. And the carbon footprint of red meat is high. The carbon footprint of all meats is pretty high. Some of the plants are high, but it is possible to make a difference by increasing plant consumption and diminishing meat consumption. And globally, we need to do this. And one of the weird things that happens is that in many countries, as they become economically advanced, alter their diets from a primarily plant diet to a primarily animal diet, increasingly American-style food. And this seems to go hand in hand for some reason, or has done at least, with economic development. It's the wrong way. We need to protect our forests. And labeling on food products would be immensely beneficial in this, because it's really hard to know what you're buying in the shop, what the impact of that is elsewhere. You know, palm oil is something that is in everything, processed foods in supermarkets. It's very hard to avoid. Palm kernel is used to feed dairy cows. New Zealand's the biggest importer of palm kernel on the planet. I've flown up the Malay Peninsula, up into Thailand. There are vast, vast areas of what was, not so long ago, diverse, biologically diverse forest that is now two species, oil palm and rubber. Yeah? And that vast amount of biodiversity has been wiped clear to produce two types of crops. And number 7 was raise people out of poverty to slow population growth. And so David said, you know, when he was born there was fewer than 2 billion, now we're nearly at 8. And the projections are that by the end of the current century, we're looking at nearly 13 billion people. What I really like about his proposal is something which is the bit at the bottom here. He says that we need to do this. The way we raise people out of poverty is to invest in healthcare and education. And he goes on to say, by giving everybody, access to healthcare and enabling girls in particular to stay in school for as long as possible in tertiary education, we're doing the best we can possibly do to gently but efficiently slow population growth. So education slows population growth, and that's why countries that don't value education still have very high population growth. And education is extremely, extremely important. And it's something where we need to fight for the best education systems we can have in this country, but we need to fight globally to give all people a right to a basic education, and young women particularly. In the countries that don't offer that, we need to somehow put political pressure on them to encourage them to do so. Ignorance is dangerous, hugely dangerous. We saw that under the previous presidency in the US. There is a lot of people who live in countries where you would expect there to be high standards of education and where the evidence would suggest otherwise. I mentioned earlier on about this elephant, the elephant in the room, which is human population growth. And I said I would come back to this elephant because it taught me something valuable. This elephant lives in an elephant park in Chiang Rai in northern Thailand. And I've supervised a number of PhD students who were Thai. And one of the trips, one of them was in Chiang Mai, took me up to Chiang Rai to the elephant park. And I went in, and you could buy a big bunch of bananas to give to the elephants. And I bought a big bunch of bananas, and I went over to this elephant, and I pulled off a banana and handed it to her, and she took it in her trunk, and she threw it over her shoulder, and she hit me really hard on the head. And I crouched down, and I just almost fell down, and I put the whole bunch up above me, and she took it in her trunk, put it in her mouth, and then put her trunk down and gently stroked the side of my face. What did she tell me? It is completely missing the point to deal with the magnitude of issues that we face by tinkering with something the size of an individual banana. We need, in one moment, to address a whole bunch of issues. And not one of them is important enough in isolation to deal with the problem. We need the whole bunch. And I had not realized that an elephant thinks you're being really, really inconsiderate, to put it mildly, to hand them a single banana. In July 1969, the Apollo 11 astronauts took this picture of Earth, and there was some from the Apollo 10 crew as well. And those photos taken from those Apollo expeditions were the first images that showed Earth as it really is. We think it's so huge. It's a ball sitting there in space, incredibly beautiful, but it is a small ball in a very, very large universe. And everyone who has ever existed, everything that we deal with and think of and love and care for has existed on that tiny little ball. In August 2019, before I was aware of COVID, I was at the University of Inner Mongolia and at a city called Hoahota, and we have an agreement that COVID put a halt on to have an exchange of ecology students between the two universities. And while I was there, I had opportunity to go to a field site off to the eastern part of Inner Mongolia, to a place called Zillianhot, and went to a monastery there. In the park outside the monastery was this mother making these beautiful big bubbles, and her little son on the tricycle. And as you might have gathered from the photos at the start of the talk, I enjoy photography. So I took a photograph of one of the bubbles. And what you can see in this is the prayer flags in that park. And on the computer screen, I can actually see myself as the photographer and the mother and the child in this reflection. And I realized that Earth and this bubble have a lot in common. The biosphere that we all depend on for life is proportionally about as thin as the thickness of that soap bubble. Both are beautiful and both are fragile, and we need to protect the earth. I love this little comic. Approximately 66 million years ago, evaluating the asteroid mitigation program, and going, well, that's going to cost a fortune. If we don't do it, we know what the consequences are. So, we need to protect and value biodiversity. We live on an amazing planet. It's the only one we currently know has life on it. It's the only one we can ever get to. Mars is extraordinarily hostile. That's not the solution. It never will be. The next star probably doesn't have habitable planets on it, and that star, with current technology, is about 70,000 years away, one way. That's not a solution. We have this planet, we have to protect it. And when we do so, we need to think not just about ourselves, but how we would be judged by the other inhabitants of this planet. Because we're all part of this beautiful place, and we need to fight for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Murray. Okay, folks, I suggest we'll go and have a cup of tea now. Get there before the rest of the population does. It's rising fairly fast. We'll be back here in about 20 minutes for questions. If you have any questions, write them on the sheet out the front. Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome back. So we've managed to generate a few questions for Murray, so we'll get those through. And if you have a further question, put your hand up and I'll bring you a microphone rather than trying to make yourself heard. Go for it, Murray.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Actually, the first question relates to an image on the slides which we have. Is it possible to project it?
Can't get them back, no. The young man that set it up is off at a meeting.
Oh, okay. I can talk about... Okay, thanks, everybody. The slide that I was going to project, if we could find it, was... it shows different ways in which people have impacted, or the different issues that we have to face when we look at threats to biodiversity. And on the list we have land clearance, deforestation, habitat destruction. That has historically been number one. When we look around the world at where biodiversity has most rapidly been lost, it has been as a direct result of those very rapid changes in landscape. And New Zealand is, the same as the rest of the world. With regard to that, if you drive from Cape Reinga to Bluff, where do you go through native forest? The entire length of the country. And there's a little bit you go through up in Brendurwin Hills and the Dome Forest towards Northland. There's the volcanic plateau. You can see some off to the left as you're heading down towards Wellington. Most of it's gorse. And then you go across the Cook Strait and you keep going down. If you take a little detour through the Catlins, you might see a little bit. Most of it's pine forest now. Our country that prides itself on conservation has so little of our native habitat visible from our primary highway. That was one. The second, amongst those points on the slide was we have exploitation, over-exploitation, harvesting of stuff. Everywhere we go, we overfish. Fisheries, get destroyed globally. We've been incredibly bad at that. And there's pollution and climate change, or global change, or atmospheric change on that list. But the one that the question related to was about invasive species. And I didn't make any mention of it, it was just on the slide. And it relates to what invasive species are, where their impact is. Invasive species are numerous and diverse and seriously problematic. So in New Zealand, we are fully aware of some seriously challenging issues we've had with possums and with rabbits, with wild deer in places, and so on. But for our country, amongst the most serious in terms of native wildlife have been mustelids and rats. And the impacts of those extends into areas that we haven't had impacts from something else from. So things like land clearance, deforestation, and so on, that I've mentioned as a major issue. You then move away to the areas that we haven't done that, and yet invasive species go into those areas and have a big impact. And we do need to invest in the control of those pest species. Globally, invasive species are a serious problem for both biodiversity, but also for the actual economics of growing food, because they increase the cost. Does that answer the question? Thank you. The next question was, much economic growth is in the area of services, and is this a problem? I'm not against economic growth, I think that people need to have incomes, and I'm not sure if I understand the question fully, so if I get it wrong, please put me in the direction you were thinking. But, the economy of a nation is complex and interwoven, and people contribute in many different ways to the economics of a place. And purchasing services, we talk about a knowledge economy and so on, isn't without its own costs. This may be off to a side a little bit, but think about, I was astonished when I learnt that cryptocurrencies have a vast carbon footprint. And you go, how does that happen? It's because, unbeknownst to people who haven't investigated it, it involves extraordinary interconnections of computers and a vast amount of electricity to keep things going. So some activities that at face value look like they should actually be benign, when you delve into them, you discover they're not always. So I don't know if there is a simple answer to this. I think that everything that we engage in warrants careful investigation. Does that address the question, the answer to the person who asked that? Maybe? Okay. There's a question about the role of government and legislation to control consumption. There's an example about appliances and how we now live in a society where when something breaks, you throw it away and buy a new one. So there's two different levels of issues here. I'll deal with the first one, with the appliances. The world used to be very different. Things were made to last, and people then offered services to fix them. And that might perhaps feed into the previous question. And so, you can have useful employment from different pathways. So much of what we buy and throw away now has been made offshore, and we should look at that as well, because at the moment we do things that are not just throwing it away, but when you start looking at the reality of the pathway that an item that you have purchased has made, it can get absurd. I'll give you an example. In the northern part of Australia, bauxite is mined with massive machines that put the aluminium ore onto ships. And they take them all the way down to Bluff and put them into smelters, turn it into aluminium ingots with a huge amount of consumption of electricity. Then those ingots, by and large, go back to Australia and are processed into things, including soft drink cans. Those cans are then imported back into New Zealand to the place in Palmerston North where soft drink is put into those. And then those filled cans are distributed around the country and exported throughout the Pacific and back to Australia. I think I'll leave it at that. If that is not absurd, I'm not sure what is. Okay. There's a question about, could we reduce extinctions by making endangered species commercially valuable? The answer to that is simplistically yes, but it depends what you want to have happen to those species. If a chicken actually had a slightly bigger neural capacity than it tends to have, and you ask the question of, is it happy now that there are so many chickens on the planet? And my answer, yes, because it's got lots of friends around. But if it actually had the ability to think about the fact that most of its siblings, all the male ones at least, ended up getting blended as a chick, it may be less impressed with it. And if they knew their fate. Making a species economically valuable does a few things. If you're going to consume it, it actually turns human diet into something which is incredibly boring and uniform. Globally, we are moving towards the consumption of an extraordinarily small number of species. The smallest number of species that humans have ever eaten in our history. You know, you can buy a chicken, a breed of sheep, a breed of cow, and a few other species. We're doing the same with vegetables. We bring in new varieties, but globally, we're actually reducing the diversity. So if the purpose of making something economically viable means consumption, it's not necessarily a good thing. On the other hand, if economically viable means having available something that could be used for ecotourism, for example, you might be in a different situation. An example of that is that over in Hawke's Bay, Cape Kidnappers, there's a commercially viable golf course that has a predator-proof fence across most of it. It's open at the beaches and in the middle, and there has been intensive predator control in there. And that peninsula, the Cape Kidnappers Peninsula, now has kiwi. It actually has a whole range of species that have, native species that have been reintroduced. And so the value that has been gained from that is the owner gets revenue not just from people going there to play golf, but revenue from people who want to go and see wildlife and have a guide to take them around. So you've got to think about the picture, about what it is you're going to do with the wildlife and how you make them commercially viable as to whether this is going to be beneficial to biodiversity or not. That helps? And the final question I've got here was that it seems we need to reduce our livestock. What should we do with the land, especially high country, and should we encourage native animals? New Zealand's biodiversity would be enhanced and protected significantly if there was more habitat available to it. But interestingly, it comes at a cost. Because we have so many invasive species, if you just have the habitat and do not intensively manage it, its value diminishes hugely. So if you are going to rehabilitate, it is more than simply taking sheep off high country stations, and revegetating. It would need more than that. It's more than taking cattle out of areas where forest once was and just letting it regrow. So what we need is to design protected areas that are not just protected by a fence, but protected by intensive, appropriate management as well. So there is an absolute cost beyond just simply shutting off land. Yeah. And we do ultimately need to have people with livelihoods. All I'm saying is that the nature of those livelihoods needs to change from what they have traditionally been.
Yeah. It also occurs to me, Murray, the notion of what we're doing up north, especially where we're putting prime market garden land and building houses on it, seems to be shooting your feet off with a machine gun, really.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, I grew up in that area, and we have areas. We do need to continue feeding people.
Agreed. Yep.
We do. We need to globally be very mindful about what diet we consume, but we also need to think about the most economically viable ways of growing things and where you do that. And if converting high quality production land into houses means you then have to spend a lot more money to import fertilizers to make less productive areas viable, it is just another absurdity, like the aluminium pathway.
Yes, most certainly. So, look, are there any more Subsequent questions that anybody would like to raise? I'll hand this over to Stuart.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Murray. I have to say, one, you've really emphasised the complexity of this and the broad and long-term consequences, but there's a whole dimension that you've missed out. If there's a problem with all these introduced species and the damage that they're doing and so on, surely the major introduced species, and you have talked about indirectly that, is humans. Yes. And if we were part of the great extinction, would the world actually be a better place? But so it does raise the thing, how can we save the planet and wildlife while keeping our standard of living and our population numbers and so on and so forth? So
yeah. One comment I'd make about this. So we know from people who have attempted to reduce human population size by
other means.
Other means. that is never a good solution. We do need to reduce human population size by natural means, by actually reducing the number of births, letting the population decline, and figuring out how we live sustainably and economically viably within that new paradigm. But during the tea break, I was asked some questions about the complexity of development. I had opportunity a few years ago to spend a bit of time in the western part of Papua, the Indonesian side, and went to a remote village where people had lived for 1,000 years, probably longer, and had European contact for about 300 years with Portuguese, I believe, and had lived sustainably. Now, the downside was they had extremely high infant mortality. Very high, like 60% or above in the first couple of years of life. And Europeans who went there as missionaries, looked at the issues that they saw, which was that children were dying from treatable illnesses. And so they gave them Western cures. The consequence of that intervention in the absence of other more complex considerations was population explosion. And after a very, very long period of time where these people lived sustainably, they had the same number of births because there was no birth control. There was nothing put in place to regulate that. So their population grew to the point where they could no longer live sustainably there without importing stuff. They destroyed big chunks of their forest. They overfished and destroyed their fishery. And so aid and environmental change of the sort we're looking for is complex. And if you do address just one part of the puzzle without thinking carefully about the implications of that for other part of the puzzle, you can end up with a result that's not what you were after in the first place.
Yep. Yeah, speed of transition can be a problem. Okay, and we could actually go on discussing it because I come from an economics background, so the idea of sticking numbers on things has great significance. But that aside, thank you very much for raising all these issues and I think giving us a lot to think about and to watch again on YouTube if you wish to review this and look closely at the slides. And on behalf of the audience and from U3A, thank you very much.
Okay.
And there's a small
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.